Pleasure to welcome everyone this evening and to see so many people on the call tonight. And it's a great pleasure to welcome Raymond, but I'm going to hand over the baton, as it were, to Robert, who's going to introduce Raymond officially.
Thank you, Rochelle. And good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another of Kenton Schul's Where Are You Now? Zoom sessions. A couple of weeks ago, I had the pleasure of welcoming back to Kenton Raymond Cannon, who had risen to the heights of a profession that has encompassed top-level political activity in USA, in United Nations, in media, and currently as the Chief Marketing Officer of the United Jewish Appeal. Given that Kenton in its heyday was home to a huge membership that included many outstanding personalities who were active not only within our community, but also in far wider spheres of activity, I commented then that it was hardly surprising that the next generation would include many who would be set for high achievement. Among the former members that I had in mind were Graham's parents, Raymond and Jeanette. They moved from Kenton 21 years ago before making Aliyah in 2002. It's therefore with great joy that I'm able to reintroduce Raymond and Jeanette to this meeting, where Raymond will address us, and here is a resume of his CV. Raymond was born in London in 1933, married Jeanette in 1960, and lived in Kenton for 40 years from 1960 to 2000. They have 3 sons, 2 in the United States, 1 in London, and 7 grandchildren. Raymond is a retired lawyer whose specialisms were international business and corporate transactions as a partner in a London law firm, in-house legal counsel to a major international company operating from Hong Kong, where he and Jeanette lived before making Aliyah. As a practicing lawyer, he contributed to legal and commercial books and publications on cross-border transactions and is author of Business Law of the European Union. Since making Aliyah in 2002, Raymond has attended courses over 14 years on Land of Israel studies, a combination of intensive tiyulim and lectures. He was a prominent communal leader in UK and held a number of prestigious positions as chairman of the Board of Governors of the Solomon Wolfson Jewish Day School, Michael Sobell Sinai, and also the JFS. He served as an honorary officer of the United Synagogue and chairman of its Board of Education, and was an active member of the Zionist Federation's Media Committee and of the Chief Rabbi's Advisory Committee. He was a member of Kenton's Board of Management and an honorary officer during the ministries of Rabbis Cyril Harris, Eddie Jackson, and Jeffrey Cohen. Raymond speaks to a wide range of audiences in Israel, in the US and the UK on underlying factors and issues of the Arab-Israel dispute. His talks cover all aspects of the current situation in the Middle East and are designed not only to present audiences with an overview of current developments, but provide them with information and tools to become more informed about the competing narratives. Raymond is an amateur historian with an obsessive interest in historical subjects and personalities covering English, American, and European political leaders, history, literary, and political biography, as well as modern Jewish and biblical historical themes, topics on which he speaks to a variety of groups and organizations. He has also written articles for a whole range of publications and societies in Israel and abroad. Welcome, Raymond.
Thank you very much, Robert. I didn't quite recognize myself from that very, very generous introduction, and I hope that when I do speak and tell you what I'm going to say today, you will feel that at least part of it is justified. And because I've got so much to relate about living in Israel, I've tried to limit my talk to a brief personal introduction, where we are now, our impression as citizens as opposed to being visitors to Israel, and then identify just some of the aspects and features of living here in a country what is by any standards a remarkable place that is so typically a Jewish experience, but not necessarily in the religious sense. I also want to leave time for your comments and questions, which I'd rather deal with at the end of my talk. Jeanette and I, as Robert said, were married in 1960, moved to Kenton, where we lived until 2000. We lived there for 40 years. And our three sons, you've met Graham. Jonathan lives in the United States and presently the head of Ramas School in Manhattan. And Adam, our youngest son, husband of Dr. Ellie of TV fame, who is a barrister, and they live in London. All three boys were bar mitzvah and married in Kenton Shul, where, as again Robert said, I served as an honorary officer on and off during the ministries of the late Chief Rabbi Cyril and Rabbis Eddie Jackson, Jeffrey Schissler, Jeffrey Cohen, and I believe Anne Harris, with whom we are regularly in touch, has spoken to you as well in this format. And Rabbi Jackson, I believe, is also going to get in on the act. He and Frankie, of course, live here in Israel. And Jeanette was a stalwart of the Ladies' Guild in Kenton. Here it's called the Irgun Nashim, which I first thought was a terrorist organization. And she was a pioneer of the movement to appoint women to the synagogue management hierarchy. And in United Synagogue circles, it was a move that was as momentous as the Russian Revolution. 2000, we moved to Hong Kong, where we lived and I worked until 2002 before making Aliyah. So we've lived here in Israel for 19 years. I'm sure many of you will have visited Israel and are familiar with its geography and also know something of its history. Israel's culture is most definitely not British and can best be described as Middle Eastern with a Western style veneer, hence the absence of apologetic and deferential norms or of class distinction or typically British courtesies and manners. Let me give you an amusing example. The Israel-Britain Commonwealth Association, and Jeanette is on its executive committee, is a prestigious organization of which the British ambassador is the principal promoter. He and his wife were at the opera in Tel Aviv and queuing to enter the auditorium when he heard a loud whisper from behind. "Look, that's the British ambassador, and he's Jewish." The ambassador said he knew he was in Israel when the whispering couple then pushed past him to enter the auditorium. And as an aside, Israelis never queue. Everyone is in front. So the definition of an Israeli queue is one you join from the side. Israelis are pushy, loud, and at times arrogant, and must always come first. And they regard laws as recommendations. But, and it's an important but, they are the first to help someone who has fallen over or cannot climb some steps or is having difficulty getting up from a seat. Jeanette walks these days with Nordic sticks, and she is constantly offered a hand when negotiating a steep curb or entering a lift or opening a door or crossing the road. As you know, Israel is a tiny country, comparable in size to New Jersey or Kruger National Park, a small population of around 9 million, of which 21% are Arab. The demography of what is essentially a nation of immigrants is germane to understanding Israel's culture. Here is just a brief list of the nation's ethnic mix. Arabs, Shia and Sunni Muslims, Christians, Jewish Kurds, Druze, including Syrian Druze on the Golan Heights, Bedouin, Ethiopians, Russians, Caucasians, Copts, Armenians, and they have a quarter in the Old City, Jerusalem's Old City, as well as immigrants from all the English-speaking nations and citizens from most, if not all, of the European Union member states, especially in recent years, the French. All the individuals of this ethnic mix are Israeli citizens holding an Israeli Teudat Zchut identity card. When phoning a public organization, the caller can be invited to press 1 for Hebrew, 2 for Arabic, 3 for Russian, 4 for English, and now 5 for French. And if there is time, I can tell you some hilarious experiences with those options. But we need a separate talk to discuss Israel's ethnic minorities, most of whom I've had the privilege of meeting as part of the Land of Israel studies with Machanav Shalom, and which I attended, as Robert said, for a dozen or so years. Here are some early impressions, some of them surprising. There is a widespread lack of spoken English at every level. Something really astonished me. The English language edition of the Haaretz newspaper carried recently an article emphasizing that the inability of Israelis to speak, read, and write English will have a seriously detrimental effect on the long-term commercial and economic development of the state. Another impression is the youthful population, the median age just over 30, and a profusion of babies. The highest birth rate in the Western world by far, 3.1 per woman, which is not limited to Haredim. And it's said that a high birth rate is a sign of national confidence. Babysitting is an unprofitable job as Israelis take their children with them everywhere, at all hours of the day and night. It's not unusual to see a newborn baby just a few weeks old sleeping in a stroller next to the table in a restaurant where its parents are having a meal. Parents maneuver their strollers inside shopping malls and in restaurants, and every eating establishment will have a bank of high chairs at the ready. Jeanette and I once went to a UK restaurant which displayed a notice, "No children under the age of 16. That's just unthinkable here, but would be considered a criminal denial of a basic human right. Children go to kindergarten when a year or so old. A toddler will make his or her own way to school at a very early age. Israel is a safe environment, and young girls and women have no fear of being out and about day and night on their own." Another interesting observation is that there is relatively little obesity, which is so prevalent, for example, in the United States. Israelis eat well, eat plenty, and enthusiastically, but their choice meal is more often than not a salad, and Israeli salads are exceptional by any standards. It's the so-called Mediterranean diet, easy in Israel, with its enormous variety of fresh fruit and vegetables, as any trip to a shuk, a market, will become obvious. And the restaurant scene is now world-class in Israel. Hebrew is, of course, the national language, and Arabic has a special status. For most British Olim, but not American, the Hebrew language is a huge barrier. It's a damning indictment of Jewish educational failure, given that most Jews read frequently from religious texts, invariably pointed Hebrew with vowels, without knowing what the words mean. Also, unfamiliarity with Hebrew script is another barrier. Hebrew is almost entirely written here without vowels. And learning the language at this stage of our lives is well-nigh an impossible task. We went to Ulpan, but that didn't really help. Jeanette reads and writes comfortably and can cope in a supermarket, reading the product names, special offers, and even ingredients, but she hesitates to speak. I'm prepared to practice my Ivrit whenever possible and can make sentences without verbs, and now have mastered the numbers. Now that's important because taking a numbered ticket in many situations is standard, and you have to know when your number is called and which numbered desk or room you must go to. Every male and female at the age of 18 must go into the IDF or do national service. Haredi exemption is a topic all of its own, so I won't even touch that this evening. A normal sight, but unusual in British eyes, is that every soldier, however dressed, must at all times carry their gun, and it can never, ever be left anywhere unattended. So it's quite usual to see a group of soldiers in a restaurant or at a wedding or other simcha with their guns, and even army girls on the beach in their bikinis still have to carry their gun. And the girls turn their uniforms into a fashion item to retain their glamorous appearance. And when a senior officer gives a press conference, the speaker turns out to be an authoritative 21-year-old girl with considerable military experience. Young soldiers have enormous responsibility for their nation's safety. It's a responsibility they take very seriously because they know they are protecting their own families and friends. And what is not appreciated in the diaspora is the genuine, even passionate commitment of these young people. Jeanette and I were chatting with a server in a restaurant. She was perhaps 17, and I remarked, how did she manage when her university education had to be postponed because of army service? In Israel, Israelis go to university after finishing army service. Her response was brutally revealing. We have to defend and protect our Jewish country, and that's all that matters. And she also remarked in passing that she wanted to go in the Navy. Why? Because she looked good in white. Our cleaner's daughter is doing her military service. She's an officer on the dangerous Gaza border, and her mum wanted to know why she chose a combat unit. Her answer, I'm Jewish, and it's my duty to defend our country. That this is a Jewish country is exemplified by the following humorous examples. When we arrived from Hong Kong, our container was unloaded at the port of Ashdod. The customs officer called me. Raymond, why do you need 2 dishwashers? I said, one for milk and one for me. Ah, he said, but in Israel, the halakha is that only 1 dishwasher is required, so I will have to pay duty on the second one. Another example. A bird got stuck in our outside air conditioning unit. The engineer I called to free the bird said he couldn't do it. Why? Because the halakha forbade removing a bird nesting on its eggs. He would return when they had hatched. I doubt in many countries the Bible would offer a defining opinion, even for someone who was particularly not dati. Another Jewish moment. I was receiving medical treatment at Hadassah Hospital, Jerusalem, and the technician was a very frum lady, long skirt sheitel, and she asked me if I could bring her assistant from Netanya when I came to the hospital. No problem, I said. But one day, while giving me medical treatment, she asked me what I thought of her assistant, and could I find him a shidduch? And one Friday afternoon, a bus with passengers drove off its prescribed route. And when the passengers protested, the driver explained that an elderly passenger had asked him to drop her off at her home, as she would otherwise be late for Shabbat. The passengers understood perfectly. Jeanette and I spent Pesach in a hotel in Tel Aviv, and strolling along the Tailet, the promenade, we decided to have an ice cream. The server was an Ethiopian girl who understandably asked me, Chalavi or Parv? Now, I don't think you'd have the same inquiry in Tesco or in Waitrose. These are admittedly insignificant events, but so Jewish in character and so taken for granted here. No further explanation is required. But above all, the evident overwhelming Jewishness of the state is due to the fact that the rhythm of life is dictated entirely by the Hebrew calendar. As you probably know, in Hebrew, the days of the week have no names, just first day, second day, and so on. But there is no number for Saturday. It's Shabbat for everybody. This is not a religious thing, it's what it is, Shabbat. In whatever way it is observed, it's Shabbat. It's irrelevant whether you're traditionally going to shul, observing Shabbat, or going on the beach. When meeting friends and even strangers and shopkeepers and taxi drivers, everyone wishes everybody Shabbat Shalom. I can remember a sermon that the Rabbi Harris, then Rabbi Harris, delivered in Kenton Shul many years ago, when he told the congregation that they must distinguish Saturday from Shabbat. And that's easy in Israel because there is no Hebrew word for Saturday. And the weekend here is known as Shishi Shabbat, Shishi being Friday. Expats cannot get used to Sunday being a normal working day when the rest of the world is closed. So when Monday arrives, no one is sure what day it is. I've been known to phone a UK bank on a Sunday and getting annoyed when nobody answered the phone when Jeanette had to remind me that banks in the UK don't usually open on Sundays. Chagim here are national events which the whole nation celebrates. They're not just confined to a local shul or a local community. Pesach is, of course, a major holiday, and Seder, in whatever form, is celebrated by more or less the whole nation and every family. Matzah is standard fare throughout, and I've often remarked that Israel becomes one huge matzah ramble. When it's Shavuot, all the bakeries are selling cheesecake. On Sukkot, there is a sukkah outside nearly every cafe and restaurant, in apartment car parks, in town squares, in all public places. And Yom Kippur, there is not one single vehicle on the road, and the highways are given over to children on their bikes. And fasting, whether the individual is religious or not, is the norm. And on Hanukkah, everyone lights a Hanukkah, and donuts are eaten, safganiot, in every cafe and every patisserie. And Purim sees the whole nation in fancy dress, with children dressed up for children's parades. And on Yom HaShoah and Yom HaZikaron, the whole nation stops at the sound of the siren. Drivers get out of their cars and stand in silence. Buses and taxis stop. Nobody moves until the siren marks the end of the period of reflection. And as for Yom HaTzmaut, which is, of course, in a couple of days' time, an explosion of joy and pride. I want to mention, if only briefly, Israel's medical services and its technology, which are the envy of and an example for the whole Western world. Every citizen is a member of a chuppah, an HMO, a medical insurer. For example, we are members of Maccabi Shali and pay a nominal, and I mean nominal, monthly premium. This entitles us to every possible medical treatment we may possibly need at any age, whether from a family doctor, a consultant, a specialist. It includes major surgery, hospitalization, every test and examination, and as well as aftercare, like, for example, physiotherapy and so on. Everything is digitized, almost no paper. If I need a blood test, a prescription, an X-ray, the doctor posts the referral on my personal website, and I just go to any Maccabi facility, produce my medical card, and the test is performed. If I want a prescription, it also goes onto my website. The prescription is then available for me to dispense at any pharmacy anywhere in Israel using my medical card. And the results of these tests are available instantly for the doctor, and I can look at them on my computer a few hours later. Sheba Hospital, Tel Shomer, you may have heard of, in Tel Aviv, is rated one of the top 10 hospitals in the world, proudly announced in Hebrew, of course, in big letters at the main entrance. At minimal cost, and if needed at no cost, every citizen will be treated, even members of Hamas and the Palestinian Authority. And did you know Israel provided a field hospital in the Galilee for Syrian refugees fleeing the civil war? As I mentioned, there's no class distinction. And in my opening remarks, I mentioned too that Israel is not Britain. First names are automatically used. I can't recall even once being addressed as Mr. Cannon. And there's not too much respect for authority, for as I said, laws in Israel are only recommendations. Here's a typical example. Our street on which we live, our building, our apartment building, is Nitsa Boulevard. It runs parallel to the sea, it's overlooking the sea and along the promenade, and is a through route from the north to Netanya's Central Square. Our apartment block is on the corner of a road called Shaul HaMelech, running at right angles to Nitsa Boulevard. And sometimes Nitsa, closed for roadworks or whatever reason, a police car is stationed on the junction, directing traffic to turn left into Shul HaMelech. Without exception, every driver stops and argues for several minutes with the police why he or she cannot continue along Nitsa. And the exasperated driver never accepts the explanation. It's his country. Why can't he drive along his roads? I mentioned earlier that 21% of the population is Arab, a community approximately 2 million strong. And unlike the impression in Western media, the Israeli Arab population is totally integrated. There are Arab doctors, Arab nurses, Arab police, Arab judges, Arab politicians. Currently, the Arab party in the Knesset is the official opposition. They all hold, of course, as Israeli Arabs, Israeli ID, and have exactly the same citizens' rights as Jews. There are, of course, instances of local discrimination, which any minority experiences, but it is not institutionalized and certainly not apartheid. Anyone visiting Israel would acknowledge the veracity of this situation. It's also worth mentioning in passing that Israel goes to extraordinary lengths and expense to protect wildlife. If you travel along Route 1 between Jerusalem and Tel Aviv, you'll go through a short tunnel built solely to ensure animals can traverse the highway, which would otherwise have dissected their normal habitat. This example is repeated in all parts of the country where transport interferes with the natural movement of wild animals. In the time we have lived here, the roadway system has developed and expanded enormously, and the country has a breathtaking system of highways. But road traffic has increased as well, and jams are the norm. So take the train, a super duper modern network that is constantly being expanded and improved. I could go on, but you may have questions and comments and have heard enough. I've deliberately avoided talking about politics, about the electoral system, about the security situation, about the Palestinian issue and the whole area of international relations. Huge topics that need an in-depth discussion and a full understanding of the history of the region, at least since 1917, if not earlier. Suffice to say, just for now, and I'm sure many of you are asked to explain, to justify, to defend Israel, the points that I think you need to bear in mind are that Israel has land borders to the north, to Syria and Lebanon, to the east with Jordan, and to the south with Gaza and Egypt, not really friendly neighbors. That reality dictates Israel's policies and security decisions. Bear in mind too, there is no recognized or defined border with the West Bank, Judea and Samaria, except the divisions into areas A, B, and C under the Oslo Accords. The Green Line, which is erroneously called the 1967 border, is not a border at all. It's never been a border. It is simply the ceasefire line at the end of the 1948 War of Independence. So let's pause for breath and leave it to you to ask any questions, make any comments, or any elucidation that you feel I need to make. Thank you.
Raymond, thank you. That was most interesting and lovely to hear you to speak about your experiences. One thing, if I can put a question in first, because I don't see anybody with their blue hands raised on the chat line. You mentioned how the Arab population have integrated themselves into so many aspects of life. The hospitals are full. I did a concert in Haifa University a couple of years ago. The corridors were full of Arab students there. And when people tell me, or when I hear people saying that it's an apartheid state, I say, look, I'm not proud that the president is in prison, but I'm quite happy that it was an Arab judge who put it there. And that's not really conducive to apartheid. And how is it that Israel hasn't managed to effectively talk this out of population, out of circulation?
Well, this is a very common question. Why is Israel's public relations so poor? And I think the answer is, there are two answers. One is that Israelis don't think they have to justify what they do to anybody. They don't see the point of trying to explain their point of view, because that's what they do and that's how they do it, and they've got good reason for doing it. It's not an Israeli thing to justify what they do. Also, the media is very hesitant to listen to Israeli explanations. I found that because I did quite a lot of work with the Zionist Federation in London, and it's nearly impossible to get the leading media, particularly BBC and television programs, to present a balanced view of the situation in Israel. And Israelis are not, as I said, good at it. But on the other hand, the media doesn't seem to care or want to give a particularly, as the word I just used, balanced view. I spent a lot of time. Indeed, I came to Kenton twice and spoke to the community about Palestinian issues in Israel. And I was astonished. I spoke in Stanmore as well, how little people in the UK understood the situation in Israel. They didn't really know enough about it to be able to make an informed judgment, and they were influenced very much by the media. And you can't change the media. People have views, entrenched views, and that's it. The integration of the Arab population here, we remark on it all the time. I was out today for a stroll on the Tayelet, and there's an Arab lady there with her baby. The other day, you go in a restaurant, the Arab families are there. You go to a public swimming pool, the Arab families are there. They're on the beach. But these are the problem is there are two forms of Arabs, are there not, in terms of politics? There's the Palestinian Arabs who are not Israeli citizens, who live on what's called the West Bank, Judea, Samaria. And that's where the issue, I think, gets confused. You mentioned an Arab judge sending an Arab to prison. There was a Druze president. An interim president was a Druze here, which I don't think many people in the world realize.
Thank you very much. I don't see anybody with questions. Danny, I think you've put a question in. Would you like to unmute yourself and put it to Raymond?
Hi, Raymond. Nice to see you again and talk to you again. I've been to Israel a few times, and my impression is that if you want to get something done, you have to shout and shout louder and possibly even louder. And only then do they listen to you. So what I want to know is, when, being the polite British person that you are, if you're in a queue, whether it's a bus queue or any other queue, and they start pushing in front of you, are you British and say after you, and you end up at the back of the queue? Or are you Israeli and you stick your arms out and say, hey, mate, I was there first?
Are you shouting in Hebrew and English?
Well, I mean, since you said you had problems with the language, let's say you're shouting in English.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, we lived in Hong Kong, and this very similar situation. When the train, an underground train stopped and the doors opened, nobody waited for the people to come out. Every Chinese person was pushing to get in. It's culture. The English, I mean, Americans are very, very disciplined and stand in line. The British queue very well. Israelis do not queue. Everybody, they say they do queue, they're in front. Everybody is in front. I mean, that's the beginning and the end of the matter. Now, it's yes, of course, it's not British, but we're not, the Israelis are not British. And if you go into any country in the Middle East, you're going to find a very similar situation. I mean, I drive here. A lot of people won't drive here. Jeanette has never driven here because it's hair racing. It's a very different style. Because an Israeli feels that it is, he's failed if he's behind another car. He should be in front. Everybody wants to be in front. When they opened Route 6, I don't know if you're familiar with the road system here. Route 6 was the first toll road in Israel. And Israelis were furious at the concept of having to pay to drive on a road. After all, it's their country. Why should they have to pay to drive on one of their roads? So what they did was they covered up their number plates. So, well, of course, the technology overcame it. But it's a way of thinking. It's a way of life. You can't say, well, it's not British, because it isn't British. This is, when we say this to Israelis, they say, well, you're in the Middle East. You're not in Europe. And I'm afraid...
So are you over the line? Are you Israeli now, or are you still British?
Israeli, no question. No question.
Israeli.
I know that if I stand waiting to get to the front of the queue, I'll never be served. But we have a huge advantage, Jeanette and I. We're over 80. If you are 80 or over, you automatically can go to the front of the queue. If you're in the post office, you can go straight to the post. You don't have to wait to take a number. I have a card which says I'm 80, and I'm going to go to the front.
The problem there is finding out what is the front of a queue. I think an Israeli queue is like a snake with no head and 20 tails.
You're right.
Thank you, Raymond.
Lawrence Miller, would you like to unmute yourself and ask your question, please? Welcome.
Yes. Hi, Raymond. having lived in Israel for many years now, what do you and Jeanette miss most, apart from your family and friends?
What do we miss most? What do we miss most? If I can turn your question round, when we come to England, we go to America because we've got family in America, and we come back here, we feel we've come home. We've never, the sense of returning to Israel and coming back into our apartment, we genuinely feel much more at home than we've ever felt in our whole lives. What do we miss? We used to miss tea. Jeanette says she misses English tea.
Yeah.
But we're now able to get Yorkshire tea. It's more only. I tell you, what do we miss? We miss the theatre. I would say the theatre definitely, because Israeli theatre here, of course, is in Hebrew, and there are surtitles. I think we miss that a lot. We can't go to the theatre.
There's wonderful music here.
But as Jeanette said, you have wonderful opera, you have wonderful music, you have wonderful culture. But I don't think there's anything especially apart, as you said, Lawrence, family, that we miss. We feel very, very comfortable here. We feel very at home. I mean, I go out on a Friday morning into town. When I say into town, we live on the coast, but it's a kilometer away. And the atmosphere on a Friday, on a Shabbat, everybody is buying chalot. Everybody is carrying frown. It's nothing to do with being religious or not religious. It's Shabbat. The point I made in my talk, and this wonderful feeling that Jewish things are happening all around you, and you all think much the same way. You enjoy the same sort of events, and that makes up a lot for what we've missed. Yes, we have missed afternoon tea at the Ritz, but how often did we have afternoon tea at the Ritz? We miss, yes, maybe some of the politeness. Sometimes even we get a bit exasperated, particularly in the supermarket, where the system is that you park your cart, your trolley at the kuppah, at the payout, and then walk round the shop to do your shopping and put it in the cart to prevent people coming in front of you. Yeah, we miss perhaps that. We miss Marks and Spencer maybe, because there's no equivalent here. But I don't know, I don't think we miss a great deal. I think we've lived here almost 20 years, 19 years, and we do feel very much that we're Israelis, even though we can't integrate into the Israeli society because of the language barrier. The language barrier is huge for us.
The Pesach that we've just had as an example.
Yes, Jeanette mentions we were on our own for Pesach because the family can't come, and we went to a hotel in Tel Aviv. And Jeanette was talking to a lady, and she said, "Where are you sitting for Seder?" And we said, "Well, we're on our own." And she said, "No, you're not. You're with us. You'll join our family for Seder." And the family was a Jerusalem family. I think a well-established and well-known family, 22 people in the family, and they insisted that we participate in their Seder. And we felt, that wasn't an unusual experience. So, no, Lawrence, I don't think we miss a great deal.
Thank you very much. We have another somewhat anonymous questioner. In this context, I hesitate to say fire, but with Fire Tablet, please raise your question.
Fire Tablet? Oh, I can see
Fire Tablet, please identify yourself.
I can see a hand up. And the word...
Robert, I don't think they've actually got a microphone. That's why I didn't spotlight them.
Right, okay.
If you go to Jeff Wolfson, he's on, and then Marlene Nepler.
Excellent.
My question lives up the road.
Yeah, excellent, Raymond. And thank you. My question is there inheritance tax in Israel? And if there isn't, is that a reason why some people go on Aliyah?
Well, people have got all sorts of reasons for going on Aliyah. No, there's no inheritance. You mean death duties? What we used
Yes,
to,
yes.
No, no,
Yeah.
no, no. But
It's
I
the
don't know
only
whether
thing
It's been
that's free
changed.
there.
I don't know if that's a reason why people go come to Israel. A lot of people come from the medical services here are just breathtaking. I mean, unfortunately, as we've got older, we've made a lot of use of them, but they're breathtaking and they're very Hamish. I mean, that is one of the characteristics here. I mean, I'd had treatment at the Hadassah Hospital, and when I came finally and saw the consultant, and he said the treatments worked very well, and I came out of his room and his secretary was out there, and she said, "Raymond, you're fine. Everything's gone well." Puts her arms around you, gives you a hug. Now, that's how people relate to each other. One of the things Israelis do, and I've commented this before, when Israelis meet each other, they throw their arms around each other, hug and kiss. They've only left that person 10 minutes earlier, as if they hadn't seen them for months. But that is an Israeli way of meeting people.
It's all pre-COVID.
What?
Pre-COVID.
Pre-COVID, yes, as Jeanette says, quite right. Pre-COVID. It doesn't work now these days. And then Israelis scream at each other. You listen to them shouting and yelling at each other, think, my God, they're going to pull a gun and shoot each other. They then end this shouting match, hug each other, kiss each other, shake hands and go. Israelis, it's a very noisy country. Whoever's visited here, you know, cars hoot non-stop, people shout, but, you know, we're in, when you do complain, the answer is you're in the Middle East. Marlene, hi.
Yes, Marlene, please. Unmute yourself, Marlene.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yeah, indeed.
As a very new Ola, a very new immigrant to Israel, I just this weekend completed my first 2 years. It's exactly 2 years since I've been here. I must agree with most of the things, nearly everything Raymond has said, because I have just been experiencing most of these things in these last 2 years. I was driving in London. I always had a car. I've got an Israeli driving license, but I am absolutely terrified to drive here. I just wouldn't even contemplate it, apart from the expense.
It's the same, exactly.
I live just round the corner from Raymond in Rehov Mall, just off Shalom Elet, so I'm really literally round the corner to him. And you really don't need a car because the taxis are available all the time and quite cheap. Apart from the fact that I'm terrified even in the taxi, because the way the taxi drivers drive is literally quite frightening. I won't go on about that. The medical, as Raymond said, the medical facilities here are absolutely amazing because it is all preventative. It's nothing like in the UK with the NHS. As he said, everything is digitalized, and because everything is preventative, as a new immigrant, you get an MOT a health MOT from top to tail. In the last 2 years, I haven't stopped having blood tests, visiting every ologist there is, every consultant you can think about. The doctor goes through this whole list, and the last thing he said to me, well, have you seen a cardiologist? I said, well, no, I didn't think I needed to see a cardiologist. He says, well, you know, you haven't seen one yet. Maybe it would be a good idea to have a checkup. They send you everywhere. So, and as he said, it's so available. It's really excellent. You don't really have to wait. Sometimes there's a
I think
long.
I've had more blood tests here in the years we've lived here in the preceding 70 years I lived in the UK.
Well,
I voted here more than I've ever voted.
Well, exactly. In the last 2 years, I won't tell you how many blood tests I've had.
I've suggested to the International Olympic Committee that you have a new sport for the Olympic Games called elections, because I think Israel would get gold medals for that. A whole nother subject, really is another subject entirely.
I think over the last year, Israelis have actually learned how to queue because of the pandemic, and people not being able to go out or do the things that we were all used to doing. They've all had to queue a lot more because only so many people were allowed in at any one time, and you had to queue to get your vaccination. And I have to say, I think Israelis have come around a little bit more to the fact that you've got to queue. We even had to queue to go into the Postal. You know, you do have to take a number for everything. So people do queue in a way. But as Raymond said, the concept of queuing is not there. Everything here is illogical. If you think of anything that you need to do, you would do it in a logical way. But you just find that everything here is illogical. It's always the other way. There seems to be no reason why it has to be done in an illogical way.
It's a challenge, Marlene. Thank you very much. I just wonder sometimes with Israeli drivers whether they are wonderful drivers because they drive so badly and they keep driving, or they're terrible drivers because they keep driving so badly. I'm also fascinated by the fact that instead of using their indicators when they change lane, they signal with their front wheels. If you keep your eye on that, you can always see who they're going to drive in front of.
There is a thing about it. I think again that they feel it's a bit sort of babyish to indicate. They never, even the police cars, nobody seems to use their indicators. Yeah, I've got used to that. I'm familiar with that. I mean, I've driven a lot in Israel, all over Israel. I mentioned in my talk, Machanaf Shalom, Land of Israel Studies. Land of Israel Studies really gave me an enormous understanding and insight about this country. It's a course in English, which is a combination of lectures and tiolim. And the lecturers take you on the trips, the tiolim. And I did it, I've more or less stopped now because I find the tiolim a little more difficult, but I did it for over a dozen years. And it runs for an academic year. And there's nothing about Israel that we haven't learned. You've learned all about it. So I mentioned the demography and we visited all of the minorities here who are very, very interesting people. Many of you probably never heard of the Caucasians. Many people don't know that Kurds could be Jews. You've got on the Golan Heights, you've got the Druze who are Syrians with Syrian nationality, because although they support the state of Israel, they have family in Syria and don't want to take on Israeli citizenship because it may have a bad effect on their own families in Syria. I mean, I don't know if any of you have been up to the Golan Heights or been along the Syrian border or along the Lebanese border. These aren't borders in the sense that you've got a very formal border. You've got a hedge, you've got a fence. I mean, you're in a field, and the field next to you is Lebanon. And the whole idea in this, that you can stand in the north and you can look left at Syria, straight ahead at Lebanon, and to the right at Jordan. You can be in Eilat And there's Egypt across the road, and there's Saudi Arabia just down there on the Red Sea. I did a tiur in the Negev, 3 days in the Negev, and went on into Jordan and another 3 days in Jordan. Jordan, a very interesting country, but it's all on top of you. It's not like, you know, people think that Israel is some massive, great country. It's so small that before you look round, you're on a border. You get in a car, you drive, and you've been going an hour, hour and a half. You go north a couple of hours, and you're on the border with Lebanon, with Syria. And I think what I've learned in this course, it's not only demography. I've learned how Israel uses water. Water is a huge issue. When we came here, I had notices on the bathroom doors for our kids who came from America and England: save water, have a short shower. In the years we've been here, it's transformed. We have no water problem in this country because of desalination and because of the organization of water. China comes to Israel to learn how to conserve and use water management. China has a population of 1-point-something billion. We have a population of 8-9 million, and yet they come to Israel to learn water management. I mean, the technology here, you go to I don't know if you've been in Arava, down to you see trees in the desert. We all know the desert blooming. Israel make the desert bloom. There isn't, tell me to stop if we're running out of time, but there is an anecdote that King Hussein, the late King Hussein, came to Israel in a helicopter to have a meeting in Jerusalem with the ministry in Jerusalem. And he asked the pilot, look, we're coming across the Jordan River. Our side is a desert. The other side, there are trees, there are bushes, there are plantations. Why has Israel exactly the same area of land, exactly the same desert, flourishing, and we have got a desert? And in fact, the Israelis have helped Jordan enormously to cultivate the desert. All these things about this country that we've learned, and I've learned from studies and so on, have left me it's breathtaking what's going on here. Although there are some things here which I think are appalling, not least the politics, but, you know, I suppose we would like to think we're Israelis now, and we're into that sort of state of mind.
Thank you, Raymond. If I could ask now another one of our missed emigres, Ruth Bronzite, who didn't quite get as far as Israel, but please raise your question, Ruth, and welcome.
Okay. Hi, Raymond. You may not know it, but I see Adam from time to time because he's best friends with my niece, so I see him jointly, which is lovely. I'm going to slightly disagree about the medical system through the eyes of my daughter, who has been in Israel for, 12 years and came with little children and really had a very hard time with a sick child. I mean, she was sent from pillar to post, and one person would say, you need a petek from A, and A said, you can't have it, you've got to go to B, C, D, and you end up at you didn't need the petek after all. And on one occasion, one of her children was denied an operation because 2 arms of the same insurance company couldn't agree who was going to pay for it. And this was a little child who had been built up and had to wait another couple of months. It wasn't nice. But my question is, why is there no reasonable postal service?
Well, can I ask the question myself? The postal service here has collapsed. It's never been very good, but now it is completely collapsed. I don't know the answer. Israelis are asking that question as well. We don't get any post. Post may come once or twice a week, maybe not. the post, when it does come, very often is put in the wrong mailbox, very often in the wrong building. I don't know the answer to that. And Israelis themselves have given up on the post office completely.
Well, it's very funny because my granddaughter, who was going to go into the army, kept getting letters to come to appointments, which arrived 2 or 3 weeks after the appointment. And then she got into trouble because of that, which was quite an interesting. Why did the army even use the post when they're so fluent with emails and text? I mean, it's a crazy situation. And I'm told never to post anything to my daughter, ever. Will never get there, and it doesn't.
I would certainly don't hold Israel out as a state of perfection.
It's a shame to have no mail, though. But thank you. Nice to see you.
Thank you. Roy Block, please raise your question.
Hello, Raymond. Lovely to hear your talk, and it all sounds so familiar, having visited Israel many times. Ruth has really preempted my question about the Postal Service, but instead I will tell you a little yarn of just what happened just this week. We sent a gift to our daughter. She got a phone call from the can you hear me? You're frowning. Can you hear?
Go ahead, it's fine.
She got a phone call from the post office asking for her credit card details. Why do they need her credit card details? Just to make sure there's no duty to pay. So she says, is there a secure way that I can pay? Because, you know, you're not going to just give your credit card details to anybody willy-nilly. The guy on the phone says, I've got no time for this, slams the phone down. The next thing I hear, the parcel's on the back to the UK.
But this is, I mean, I don't know. I have no answer for that.
It's absolutely true. I'm waiting for post to arrive, which I don't think will ever arrive. I've had replacement things sent to me. I also feel it's absolutely dreadful.
We have a family in the United States, and the last thing they have also a very unreliable postal service in the United States. It's because the postal service really, the cost of running a postal service is very high, and clearly they cannot generate enough income to justify the cost of running an efficient service. I mean, and the government, well, we never know what the government finances. It probably doesn't provide the financial provision that the postal service would need in order to run efficiently. Mainly because, as I say, today, far fewer letters. I mean, Robert will know as well as I do that when we first went into our respective professions, the mail was standard. Everything went by post. When I came into the law, everything was by post. But nothing goes by post anymore. Everything, even when I deal with lawyers here, nobody deals with letters. It's all technology, WhatsApp, email. So I think, you know, the post office has lost an enormous amount of business because of that. I mean, and Amazon, for example, delivers, it has its own delivery service. It doesn't use the post office. So I think it's because the post office cannot generate sufficient income to justify the service that the public requires.
Thank you. We have another question now from Richard Gordon. Please carry on, Richard. Lovely to see you.
Hi, hi, Raymond. I'm an Oleh Chadash. I've been living now in Israel for 7 months. And whilst I agree with a lot of what you've said, I also disagree with a lot of things. Speaking, okay, from my own experience, first of all, since you've recently just been talking about the Postal Service, we have no problem at all with the Postal Service. All our bills arrive absolutely sort of on time.
You know why? Because the bills from the authorities use a private delivery service.
Ah, that may be. I just open my post box and I see everything in there. I subscribe to the Spectator. Each week I get the Spectator arrives fine. I've bought things from Amazon in the United States, and I've had books sent from the United Kingdom. it arrives via the postal service. Admittedly, they leave a note saying, or they phone me and say, I can pick the parcel up from a coffee bar or a shop in the main street, but the stuff arrives and it arrives easily. We've had, unlike my sister Marley in Nepla, I've had no problem at all receiving information by the post. Second, another thing, driving. I drive an immense amount in Israel, and I actually get irritated when people seem to criticize Israeli drivers. I feel unduly. I drive and I see what goes on, right? There's a certain amount of lane indiscipline, but largely the discipline is pretty good. As I say, I drive a lot, and the road system in many respects is fantastic. And the driving on the whole, I think, is fine. I have no problem driving around. Unlike Marlene, I'm not scared out of my wits to actually drive. I agree with you about the medical services. I'm sorry to hear that the other lady seemed to have had a bad experience with a young child, a sort of granddaughter or child. My experience is a bit like Marlene's and yours. I've had more tests in the 7 months I've been here than I ever had in the United Kingdom. Even a thing like a bone density test. The Israelis were surprised that I had never had a bone density test in my life. And in fact, when I went for the test, the woman says, she could see my age. She says, you know, why are you coming for a bone density test? Have you not had one before? I said, no, I'm an Ole Chadash. I'm from England. Never had a bone.
Probably didn't know what a bone density test was. No. With the driving in Israel isn't good. Your experience, I think, is an overall experience. Israel has the worst record of almost of any state for deaths on the road. The number of people killed on the roads in Israel far exceeds the number killed by terrorists. Now, the statistics, those are the statistics. They're not, yes, you can drive. I mean, I drive a lot in Israel, around the country, and you can have periods when the driving is good. But the weaving in and out, the lane changing, the lack of signaling is very prevalent. I'm not saying it's better in England. I don't know. I haven't driven in England for a long time. And some people say it's not very good in England either. I really don't know. But the statistics of road accidents and road deaths here are horrifying. And the organizations that have attempted to change that culture have all more or less failed. So you are very fortunate in, I don't know what routes you take, but I think I've driven, I say, a hell of a lot here. People cut in, they say the lane changing, the moving, making left turns from the right-hand lane right across in front of you. It's very common here. And maybe your experience has been lucky, or maybe that's how you think driving should be.
No, I don't think driving should be like that. The things you say do happen, but I feel it's, in my experience, it tends to be more the exception than the general. I drive frequently from. We live in Ra'anana, and we have connections in Metula, and I drive from Ra'anana to Metula, and it's not bad for me. Well, queuing. You complain about the queuing. Sorry.
Go ahead.
Okay. A lot of queuing here. There is no problem with queuing because in most cases you go into a pharmacy, you go into the post office, you go in various places, you get a ticket, a petek, a number. You get, certainly with medical services. So there's no problem with queuing because you've got a number that says when it's your turn.
Not in the supermarket, not on the bus. You're waiting for a bus. standing outside waiting at a bus stop. There are no numbers there. But
or you're waiting for a taxi. I got pushed in, stood 10 minutes waiting for a taxi, and along comes somebody who stands in front of me, and he says the next taxi is mine, and I became quite Israeli. I said no way.
I'm glad to hear it, Marlene, and I'm glad to hear that you're getting acclimatized. Richard,
well, when the taxi came, I made sure I got it, and he did not get it. I became
well done, Marlene.
I didn't say a word. I didn't have to speak Hebrew. I didn't have to do anything except I opened the door and got in the taxi, and that was it.
Well done, Marlene. And Raymond, I'd like to thank you so much for spending your evening with us. Wish you and Jeanette good health and happiness.
Thank you.
We're so grateful, and it's been lovely to see you both again.
It was great seeing you both, seeing you and everybody in Kenton. It's a memory lane.
Thank you
very much.
Nice to talk to everybody.
Yes, and Hag Sameach for Yom Ha'atzmaut.
Yes, culture.
Yes, culture. Yeah, thank you very much.
Is Alan Glynnett still on there?
Where's Alan?
Alan, I just want to
I'm going to leave Zoom going for 5-10 minutes. So if everybody wants, they can unmute themselves. They can be a free for all. I'll leave it running, and so if people want to chat to each other, that's absolutely fine. Okay.
Thanks very much.
I just want to tell Alan I saw his grandson David Angel in the Museum of the Diaspora in Tel Aviv last week during Pesach with his wife and all the children. Alan, just to give you.
No, I don't think it's them. They look too old.
So you were approached by a heavenly angel.
I did.
Oh, very good.
Hi, Dave.
It's saying hello.
Oh, I can see a favourite of mine there.
Yeah.
Don't you're talking in front of your husbands.
I'm ignoring Brian. I'm ignoring Brian.
Jeanette, all the best.
I'll tell you something, Dave. I'll tell you something. The experience that we had when I went to the optician here.
No, that's not. Hi, Nadia.
In England, as you know, the optician's card are letters. Here, they are numbers.
Yes.
When I sat down to read the card, I did 1, 2, 4, 8, and then he said, right, change to the other eye. And in that nanosecond, I sent through my brain, a signal went, you are going to Ulpan, you should do the numbers in Ivrit. So I then started to go, Arba, Shosh, and the specialist said to me, you know, in all my years in the profession, I have never come across a patient whose one eye reads in it. Don't worry about the Israelis and their sense of humor.
Oh, that's hilarious.
Also, the thing is,
that's brilliant.
Raymond spoke about the post office and the problems. Yes. Well, I went down there this afternoon to collect a parcel, and there was a whole balagan outside. Everybody was waving their mobile phones because now, because since the pandemic, you have to make an appointment to go down, which is then comes back onto your phone, and it gives you a time to turn up, and that's all there. Well, as these things are suggestions, I just walk along straight to the front, show the 80 card, and miraculously the door opens. They all sit outside. So one gets over these problems with this wonderful, magical piece of plastic.
We've got around the postal system. I mean, I sent a parcel last week from Preston Road to my daughter on Kibbutz Sasa.
Yeah.
Got there in a week. If we want to send anything for our son in Tel Aviv, we take it to the post office at Preston Road. We send it to Kibbutz Sasa because the kibbutz has its own post office.
Oh, that's clever.
And it's much quicker to send it direct to Sasa, and then for Josh to drive from 2 hours from Tel Aviv to Sasa to pick his post up. Of course, because it's parcels of stuff from mummy and daddy and grandpa and papa, grandma and papa, Zoe gets the choice of the goodies before her big brother. But that's life. But certainly she sends stuff from the kibbutz. They've got a post office there. Ain Bara, no problem at all. But for Josh, if we send it to Joshua, it never gets there. Also,
I think the